The title for the lesson here today is An Appreciation for Silence. My experience with young people and my experience just in my life in general has taught me that there is some need and for appreciation of some times of silence. So I would like to do a small experiment with you all today. We'll have a moment of silence here together. All right, go ahead, we'll start. I don't know if I can go any further than that for the moment. The last 2 years in which I taught, I was able to teach at a private school. They were not associated with the Church of Christ. And every Wednesday, they would have a chapel service in the middle of their day. But when they went to chapel service, they would have a full concert pretty much during their song service time. They had a full band and drums and everything with there, and they're on a stage, and there's not only the sound elements going on, but then there is lights and laser different things, and even sometimes they would let a little smoke machine fill up. And one of the things that I tried to talk with some of my young people about at the school there was what did they like this? What appealed to them? And one of the things that I've become increasingly concerned about is, do we appreciate silence? Or maybe the overarching question today is, are we comfortable in the silence? We live in a time period and culture where everything makes a noise. Everything has got electronics going on. We live in the instant gratification society with microwaves and cell phones that are always on you. Increasingly, work is being done on computers and other things like this. And you start out maybe age 70 and go down about 5 years or 10 years in increments. That's increasingly as big a problem as you go down, and you have children and grandchildren that are being exposed to these things more and more and more. It's just part of our society. It's something that we're going to have to be able to deal with. But I think we need to be also able to see some great wisdom that we find in our scripture about the need for being alone sometimes, and sometimes being able to unplug from, maybe literally unplug from our technology, but at least unplug from distractions and other things, and the ability to be comfortable in the silence. What are some times and places in your life that you experience some of that isolation and comfortable in silence? Anyone want to share? Maybe going for a walk and being out a little bit in nature. On top of a mountain. All right. Good. All right. You hear the wind, but that's about it, right? Okay. What happened to your minds when we took that silence moment? Well, how did you feel? Did you get a little bit jittery, or you get a little bit anxious? We don't like being uncomfortable, and even a young, nervous preacher will try to talk and talk and talk, just so they don't have to hear that silence. So we need to be comfortable with the silence. And while I want to look at some, go ahead.
I was in sales for years, selling machinery, and there was an old adage, it was always told me that when you're making a presentation, or you're making an argument, or you're making a discussion, have
Oh, really? Okay, yeah.
So if you make the presentation, you make the point, and then you can't keep quiet. You got to keep going.
Sometimes there's a need for a pause. Sometimes there's a need to be able to get away. I'm going to go to several scriptures. Let's go to our first one, Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5 and verse number 12 is where we'll start. The greatest example that we see in taking some of these retreats by himself is Jesus. So let's look at a few of these here today. Luke chapter 5 and then verse number 12 is where we're starting. And it happened that he was in a certain city, that behold, a man who was full of leprosy saw Jesus, and fell on his face, and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And then he put his hand on him and touched him, and saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately the leprosy left him. And he charged to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest, and make an offering for your cleansing, as a testimony to them, just as Moses commanded. However, the report went around concerning him all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear him, and to be healed by him of their infirmities. So he himself often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. All right? You see an example of Jesus that would often withdraw into the wilderness to pray. And that gives you a little bit of something that can be done in those quiet times, in those moments when we are, say, alone or in some silence. Another example you see of Jesus is in preparation for his ministry. Let's go to Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4 and verses 1 and 2. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, afterwards he was hungry. Before Jesus' earthly ministry, and we know how much is packed into Jesus' earthly ministry, 3 years of all the things in which he did. Before he went into his ministry, how did he prepare for that ministry? Through the temptation. And he is off in the wilderness by himself, isn't he? All right. And what is he doing in those 40 days? Yes, he's fasting. What do you think is going on? The Bible doesn't say. We can speculate, though. What? Meditation. Prayer. Thinking about what it is that he's going to be accomplishing. Thinking about his own identity. What it meant to be the Son of God, and the task that he had to be going forward and doing. All right. Am I going to achieve those things as easy in the hustle and bustle of the market and surrounded by family and friends and neighbors and those things? Okay. I can't contemplate deeper things unless I am able to close some things off and be able to be comfortable in that silence. What happens then? Yes?
Jesus knew that he was going to be against the devil, which is stronger than man.
Yes.
He was going to be at his very weakest point as a human being.
I think the two most prominent times Jesus is tested are at the beginning of his ministry and then at the very end of his ministry in the garden. And you see an example both at the beginning where we're reading and then the preparation of the night before his betrayal. He's doing what? He's off alone. He's praying. He's preparing for what he's about to do. And I failed to do this too. I don't think that I'm figured it out. So many times we come through to these major moments in our lives and we just barrel right through them. There's something, gut decision or something like that. But we as Christians have an advocate with the Father who wants to act on our behalf. So we need to take the time to prepare Men, when we are going to be leading in worship, do we take the time to have some alone time to prepare what songs I'm going to select, what things I'm going to focus in on my prayers? There needs to be some time in preparation for doing those services. And I think that's a clear example of something that we see of Jesus. Another thing that I just wrote on my notes, and this is, again, something I still have to figure out for myself. How do we prepare our Saturdays? Because the next day is the Lord's Day. We are to be offering the best to God. And it may be something so simple as just laying out my clothes to get my mind into the focus of where I'm going. And sometimes it's hard. We live in a society, like I said, that is not comfortable in the silence. We like to have our TVs on all night. We like to be out with friends or sharing, in the social aspects of our lives. But I think there is something to be said for the preparation of how we approach coming into worship, coming into our Bible studies. Another example we see of Jesus choosing to be alone is when he made some decisions. Let's go to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. Luke 6. Luke 6 and verse 12. Luke 6 and verse 12. Luke 6 and verse 12 and also verse 13. Now it came to pass in those days that he went out on the mountain to pray. There's that mountain like you were speaking of. And he continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them chose 12, whom he also named apostles. What's going on? This major decision. Jesus is one man. And now he's going to surround himself with an inner circle of disciples to be his feet and hands, to help share this gospel. This is a major selection of the apostles that's going on, a major decision that he's making. How does he spend the day before? Isolated. Praying. Praying all night, it says. How do we approach those major decisions in our lives? Do we take that forethought? Do we take the preparation? Some people may take a long time to make a decision. Does that mean they're preparing, though? Sometimes I think we try to put things off. I like doing that one too. If there's a major decision that's got to be made on, 6 months from now, I'll wait 5 months and 25 days and then finally make a decision, but it doesn't mean I've necessarily thought about it or prepared or taken some time to contemplate what is going on. And so we need to be able to be comfortable in those silent times. There can be ability to have a better decision making for our lives. Can you think of some examples maybe from the Bible of people who didn't necessarily take the time to make some of those smart decisions?
The man who went to kill because he didn't help his men out.
I'm not sure if I heard you.
You know when David was going to kill, was it Naboth?
Naboth?
He was going to kill him
Or Naboth.
because he didn't help his men out. He lost his temper.
Okay, yes.
He didn't think about that.
Other examples?
Peter, when he was told he was going to deny Christ, said, "Oh, I'll never do that."
Peter's a very good example. And Peter is someone who, there's good and bad with how Peter reacts. He seems to, just, yes, impulsive. Sometimes it's okay, but sometimes he gets out in front of himself and he has to put his foot in his mouth. Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, he says, well, let's build a temple or a tabernacle for Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. To any other person, that would have been great, because you're esteeming Jesus on the level of Elijah and Moses. But this is God and God's Son. You need to hear Him, and the other ones fade away. Any other examples? Good examples?
Samson, in his choice, I mean, he didn't think through much of anything.
Yeah.
Women, choice of where to go, choice of, I mean, he just straight through.
Yes, and clouded judgments, we're not thinking. We see something shiny and we go get it. Isn't that part of what our society is?
Adam and Eve in the garden.
Yeah, I have Eve written down on there. If she's really thinking and contemplating through, should I really be doing this? But she buys into the half-truth that Satan tells. Yes. Another example, Lot. You remember when Abraham and Lot separate? Lot sees nice fertile ground over here, so he picks the nice fertile ground. Abraham says, I'll go the other way. But what's with that fertile ground? He's pitching his tent towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And every time you read about Lot in the following chapters, he's closer and closer until he has a house in the city. So you see somebody who made the decision without contemplating, what am I really doing here? The nice and shiny thing was right there first, but we didn't contemplate the greater. Saul in the Old Testament, Samuel tells Saul, I'm going to come to give the sacrifice so the army can go and will be successful. After Saul waits that 7 days, Samuel is slow to get there. And so Saul says, well, I'll go ahead and sacrifice for Samuel. And that was a big no-no, because God's prophet was the one to be doing the sacrificing. And so he got out in front of himself. And there's a lot of things you see in Saul where he's making those wrong decisions. And I don't know if they're thinking him through. Jonah makes that split decision. I don't like the Ninevites, so I'm going to go the other way. Wonderful thing about Jonah, it says in Jonah 3 and verse 1, God came to him a second time. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Sometimes we're not given second opportunities. Jonah is.
Let me give you one. We hear about a man after God's own heart.
Mm-hmm. David and the sin with Bathsheba.
Saw what he was going to have. Even a man that's after God's own heart.
Yes. Yes, when we fail to prepare, we're preparing to fail. These decisions that we make in our lives, they are major decisions. Who we're going to be with, physically. That's a major decision that I'm not thinking, and I just go.
A lot of times we use the old way we did things. For example, with Moses in the wilderness, one time he hits her and strikes her out.
Yeah, and I think there's application for you and I in Christ. There's certain ways we went about doing things before we're a Christian. Sometimes we have to change the way in which we operate when we now become a Christian. If I trust and listen to these people before I was in Christ, and they're not Christian, I might have to change the way in which I go about making those decisions. All right, another example that we see Jesus taking some time away in silence is in Matthew 14. Matthew chapter 14. Matthew 14, and we'll start in verse number 10. Matthew 14, starting verse number 10. So he sent and had John beheaded, that's Herod, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took the body away and buried it, and went out and told Jesus. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself, where we'll pause there. He went off to a deserted place by himself. What's Jesus going off and doing in this situation? Why is he going out by himself? Grief. When he heard the news, he went out and departed. There are times in our lives where silence is needed. Sometimes silence is needed when we have the passing of loved ones. And if you continue reading in verse number 13, it says, "But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities." Sometimes we want to be away from people. There's a need to cry your eyes out, to mourn for those things. And sometimes even good-minded people can smother when people need some alone time. All right? I don't think there was anything malicious in the way in which these crowds were trying to come about at Jesus. But I think Jesus is trying to have a little bit of time for himself to be able to mourn. So oftentimes, I grew up in the church, and so oftentimes you see that person who is in a grieving period, but they're being inundated and just bombarded constantly by good-minded people, but maybe in the wrong place. Yes, families like to have food cooked, when there's someone who's passed away. And yes, you want to check in on people, and those things are always good. But I think sometimes we might need to look in the perspective of the other person. What are they needing? Maybe they're needing some time to not have to talk to people. Sometimes you walk in those doors and you want to be joyous. You want to be greeting people. And sometimes you're here because you know that's the place you need to be, but it's tough. And sometimes we need to be respectful of people's times of silence. And we can be overbearing on people. Those who lose people who are outside of Christ, how do they mourn? Is it the same way? Sometimes not, though. They don't have the same opportunities. I think about Job in the Old Testament when he loses all of his possessions and all of his children, and he's, scraping the boils on his skin, and his friends come to him. How much help are those friends? Not much. His wife comes, she says, "Curse God and die." She's probably worse. All right. There's some alone time needed, and Job wanted answers from God. Job's a long book, but all of it has to do with Job seeking out those answers from God. And God comes when those other people kind of fade away. And so seeking out God, you need some silence, some wilderness experience.
3 years ago, in September, my husband's heart stopped, and he was in the 3 hospitals. And what I would do, they gave me a room at the hospital way down the hall, and what I would do, I would come out, the halls were all vacant. There wasn't a person except the nurses in the hall. And I would walk down there in my robe and gown, and I would go, there was this place that was real, it was had a beautiful view. And I would go there and I would pray, and I wouldn't pray real silent, but I wouldn't pray real loud. Just
Sure.
a prayer for my husband. And when I got through praying, or when I was in the middle of praying, this gentleman came up to me and said, "Can I help you? Is something wrong?" And no, I said,
I just want some alone time.
I just want to be alone and pray.
Yes.
My husband, our prayers were answered.
Yes.
And sometimes they're not always answered right then, but at this time they were answered. And it felt so good when I got through praying. And went down and saw Bill, and he was on the respirator and everything hooked up to him, so I couldn't talk to him,
Yep.
you know. And but God is so good. He listens to our prayers, and sometimes it feels so real,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just like you could just touch him.
Mm-hmm.
And he's so good, and I'm so thankful for the Lord's church and love and understanding when people know that you really want to be alone.
Yes.
And it's just good, and you've done such a good job as well.
Thank you. Let's look at another one. Well, I want to get to these two definitely. So let's go to Luke chapter 5. Luke 5. Luke chapter 5, verse 15 and 16. It says, "However, the report went out around concerning him all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. So he often excuse me, if this is not where I'm wanting to read from. Oh, it's the same one. Okay, he often withdrew to the wilderness." It says he often withdrew, all right? Think about how much is packed into Jesus' earthly ministry. 3 years, and all of this is accomplished that we read in our gospel accounts. Was Jesus ever in a hurry?
When he turned over the table, he sounded like
He's pretty agitated, yes, when he turns over the... But was there ever a feeling like, I gotta go? How often in the last week have you felt that way?
Just very serious.
When we got up this morning, we got to go an hour and a half to get here. And I'm on my wife. Get the clothes on the kid. We got to go. I did it about 5 times before we left this morning. How often are we in a hurry? Because we've put that on ourselves. We've put so much into our schedules. And like I said, I know we're at different stages here of demographics of people here, but I'm telling you, start at about age 70 in 5 to 10 years, and it is just more and more and more and more and more stuff we try to squeeze into our week. I'm going into a program that's an intensive 2-year program, and 2 classes every day, 5 days. The new class each day. It'll be a lot to cram into those things. And I've chose that. I don't know why I've chose that, but we tend to put ourselves into that busy state where we're always in a hurry, we're always on a rush. Jesus' ministry doesn't reflect a man who was on a clock. There was times when he knew he needed to spend time alone, to recuperate, to mourn, to make decisions, to plan. We need to have appreciation for those things. Last example I want to look at is when we face tough times. Matthew chapter 26. And I want you to notice and contrast the way in which Jesus prepares and the way in which the disciples end up preparing. Matthew 26. Matthew 26 and verse number 36. Then Jesus came with them to the place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. And he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Then he came to his disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "What, you could not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." The flesh is weak. The flesh wants to go into those things that it needs. But sometimes we need that preparation. Jesus is praying about the next day. What's happening the next day? Crucifixion. I think this is the most temptation Jesus goes through when he's saying, "Father, let this cup pass from me." He's saying, if there's any other way, let this not happen this way. The gospel writers say he could have called 10,000 angels. All right, we sing that song. I think it's so close for Jesus to say, I don't have to do this. I don't have to go through this. And that weight of having to go through that.
Anxiety, knowing exactly what was going on.
Yes. And making sure he is prepared to glorify and honor God, not fail him. Like what happens to the disciples? They failed to prepare. What happens to them? They run away. Okay? There's times we need to be in that silence. Thank you for your participation today. Thank you for your attention.